Hello, everyone. Clayton from Refold here. I'm the community manager for Refold. You may know me as George Pig on the Discord servers, and I also do the podcast. And today, I have a very special episode. It's an interview with Lamont. So, Lamont is also known as Days of French and Swedish. He's a YouTuber, and he's also a Refold partner. So, without further ado, all right, and we are as live as we are. So it's hello everybody. It's me, Clayton, aka George Pig from Refold, the community manager for Refold, and I am here with Lamont from Days of French and Swedish, and this is our very first I don't know, call it live action podcast as opposed to being just audio. Maybe there's a better term for it, Lamont. Would we call this a live action podcast? That doesn't sound right.
No, like video podcast with video.
Podcast.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, I don't know. This is not a true interview, but it's going to be kind of like an interview, but it's also
Sure.
going to be a friendly chat. So, Lamont, I heard that you have been waking up early lately, and we have um, a person in the community who also wakes up very early. And that episode from like season 1 of the podcast was really popular. He gets up at 4
Mhm.
a.m. every day.
Sure.
And I feel like that's a great place to start. How is that experiment going? I see you post about it in your like communities on YouTube.
Yeah. I would say really well. I've also been getting up around 4 a.m. It's not always the same time. The kind of rule that I set for myself is before 5 a.m. But very often that results in 4 or even like 3:30 sometimes. Yeah, it's been going really well. So it's January 25th and I've done it for 25 days of this year and I haven't really. Yeah, is it fair to say I haven't had anything but like upsides? I guess the downside is you do that if, something's going to go till 10 p.m. or something, then that becomes late night for me.
Mhm.
But I haven't had any of that yet. It'll probably change when we get further into the year. People start kind of like heading out for dinner over weekend or whatever. But yeah, it's going really well.
So there's no real downsides other than, 10 p.m. suddenly being a late night.
Yep.
All
That's
right.
that's what I would say for me. Obviously can't speak for everyone. You could say like I'm often going to bed almost immediately after my almost 3-year-old. So that was a confusing sentence. He's about to turn 3. He sometimes doesn't go to sleep until like 8 or 8:30, and then I pretty much it's like I just kind of think, oh well, time for bed, I guess. But the thing about that is that's actually kind of a positive. What I really wanted to cut out from my life was the sessions post dinner watching mindless TV or like YouTube, often it is for me, that just gets like they just drag on and on. It's like, oh, I'll just watch this one more video, and it goes, each video goes for 8 minutes, 9 minutes kind of thing. And then it's like 1 a.m. before you know it. And I haven't actually achieved anything with that time. Whereas I never do that in the morning, like ever. I never wake up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock and just like waste a few hours on YouTube or Netflix or anything like that. So that's kind of what I really wanted to change, and I also wanted to bring some um, order to how I work and study and everything. Particularly with starting a new language, I didn't want that to come at the cost of other things that I've kind of been ramping up, like the amount of effort I put into my content and stuff. It's like you either this has turned into like a kind of a rant, but like if you're doing stuff, if you're trying to get stuff done, and then you add something major like learning a language, like as in a new language. I guess I wasn't actively learning Swedish. Like I'd pretty much already gotten Swedish to the point where it was pretty comfortable.
Mhm.
So if you're doing something like adding a new language, then either you've got to cut something else out, right? And I didn't want to do anything. I was like happy with all the things that were in my life. Or you've got to find a way to be more time efficient. So I just kind of thought, you know what, after dinner, like the other thing is I have very little energy after dinner, like between dinner and bedtime. I can't, I could watch stuff in Spanish, but it's very mentally taxing for me. And and I don't get much out of that generally. And so I just go back to stuff in English because I'm like, oh, I'm too tired anyway. It's not really doing anything. But so basically, I would say I've given myself more time at which that I'm actually mentally switched on. Yeah.
Now, yeah, you've just started Spanish, and I'll get into that here in a sec. But I
Yep.
wanted to say, waking up at 4 a.m. is
Yep.
a late day for me. So I work third shift with Refold. I work on California time, but do not live in California. And waking up at 4 a.m. locally is about waking up at noon Pacific time. And I
Right.
do that on Saturday and Sunday so that I can have some semblance of a normal life.
Hmm.
Like if I wake up at 4 a.m. locally, that's late enough that I still have time in the morning, catch up on some work that I didn't get done through the week, and then come 8, I can go do things.
Yep.
And I'm usually pretty winded by like 3 p.m. or something, but I can last. And then I'm in bed
Yep.
by 8 again.
Yep.
And for me, it's technically waking up late
Yep.
by a couple hours, but it works. And I think it's if there are any other third shifters out there, give it a shot. It's not as tiring as going from actual night shift to actual day shift. It's a weird in between, and you do go
Yes.
to bed with the toddlers.
Yep. So so normally you're waking up at you're going to bed at around 5 p.m. and waking up at midnight. Is that correct?
Yes, that's pretty
Okay.
pretty close. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I
And
didn't. I
that's so weird because that's like you're waking up so early, quote unquote, that you're
early.
actually that it's actually like that's almost like you've gone full circle and you've gone back to just sleeping in really late. You go to bed
Yes.
when the sun go. Yeah. I don't know how I'd describe that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Ethan's great. He lets me take a 20-minute walk whenever the sun comes up around
Hmm.
7 a.m. so that I can get some vitamin D. And
Yeah.
uh, but back to Spanish, that is an exciting thing.
It
So
is.
when you kind of went into Swedish, if my understanding of the Lamont lore is correct, you kind of just stumbled on it. It was just sort of a thing, and you ended up jiving with it and really liking it.
Yeah, I would. It always takes a couple of different seeds, or you could say there's like the seed and the soil and the water and the sun or something to like get something to grow in my life. And um, technically, I chose Swedish in that the person who like kind of encouraged me to start a Scandinavian language was actually a Finnish woman and not like a Swedish speaking Finnish woman, just a normal Finnish woman, for want of a better term. If Finno Finn. Um, and but she invited us to Finland, and um, I basically decided that because it was in the future, it wasn't like next week, that it would be fun to learn one of the languages spoken there, as
Okay.
in one of the languages spoken in that region, because no one
So
flies. Yeah.
I was totally wrong. I was under the
Okay.
impression that you learned Swedish just on a whim, and that's different because you're learning Spanish because you do plan on going to
Yes.
traveling like Latin America and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, your motivation for getting started was similar for both. It's that you had plans at some point in the future to travel.
Yeah. It
Okay.
was, but it was also totally different in that we didn't actually have like a set date that we were going, and my wife wasn't sure that it would ever happen, because it was like, like maybe like it's really expensive, and we've never really shown any, like neither of us have a particular interest in going there. Um, but we didn't beforehand and anything like that, so it was much more speculative, I would say. um
Mhm.
but and so it was a little bit on, I still say that it was on a whim, in that I didn't actually expect it to lead anywhere, and I thought it would be just one of the many things that I kind of try and then go, oh, it just doesn't go. It's not even that I don't like it or that it's not for me. I just try stuff and it just never catches on. Like, I've kind of been vaguely into calligraphy before, in that I've like bought quite a good book on calligraphy, and I've never really sat down and kind of gotten into it. And it, so it's not something that I would say, no, I'm not interested in that. It's quite the opposite. I'm very interested in it, but it's just never kind of caught on. And that's what I thought it would be with Swedish, because I kind of thought, I was still under the impression at the time that like you can't really learn a language from an entirely foreign country. Like if you want to learn it properly, you have to be there. And I still have my thoughts around that. Like obviously there would be a massive advantage for me if I were to live in Sweden, but I now know that it's actually quite possible to become quite fluent, even more fluent than quite a lot of people who do live there, through using the right method and having the right motivation and that kind of thing. Whereas with Spanish, this was like, I'm going to buy tickets to Mexico in the next couple of months, because we don't actually have them booked, but we essentially have our tickets for the US booked, in that's not dependent on us. That's dependent on the team that my son's in, but we've paid a deposit, so like we're kind of committed to that. So that was much more like a firm thing, and that's where Spanish came from, which again I'd never shown interest before. I'd never shown interest in the past, but when you live in Australia, everywhere that doesn't speak English is like really far away. And well,
Well,
sorry,
Indonesia is like right there at the top.
it is that Indonesia, I mean, at least in Australia, I don't know if this is the case elsewhere, but in Australia, it has the reputation of being like either kind of very third worldish or extremely touristy. So, like,
Oh,
either you go to Bali and you're waited on hand and foot, by people who don't get paid enough and stuff and who all speak English. Like, I've never been, but this is sort of, it's become a very popular holiday destination. It's sort of like the equivalent of Tijuana for
mhm.
like Californians, for
And
Australians. That's,
that's a good
yeah,
example because that instantly sort of puts a, unfortunately, because I've actually been to Tijuana and I thought it was a
yeah,
fine little city.
yeah,
Um, it does put a sort of negative connotation in my head thinking about
exactly,
that. So
yeah,
you sort of have this idea of bogans going and partying it up in Bali.
exactly. That's exactly
Oh,
right.
okay.
That has become the bogan destination. And then if anyone were to ever ask me about elsewhere in Indonesia, just be like, oh, it sounds a bit, I don't know, it sounds a bit rough. And now I have no idea if that's actually true. Um, but even then, like you're talking a fair bit for like flights. You're talking more than
Mhm.
flights from say Houston to Mexico City, which is what I'll be looking at,
Right.
would cost you. Um,
Probably be comparable from going from Texas to say somewhere in Canada, maybe
yeah, probably. And like of
in
flights
terms
don't
of
depend on,
distance.
yeah, yeah, probably. But so that's like it just kind of got me excited. The idea that I could be like that close to a really properly non-English speaking country. And I know that there are like plenty of Spanish speakers in the US as well. But
Tons.
the real thing that really excited me was the idea that like, no, you will have to, like,
Mhm.
if you go out in the middle of the city in Mexico City and you want to find your way somewhere or something, you will have to speak to people in Spanish. um,
Mhm.
and what was I going to say? Well, the other thing is that I made a video about kind of how it happened, the whole getting into Spanish thing, and it was actually all on one day. I did like kind of dramatize it in the video, but that is 100% true. That all in one day, I was asked to test story learning, and I was sent the Spanish course, because like that's their most popular one, so that's the one they sent me. And then I went to this like
And
secondhand
is
book
that
fair.
Ollie Richards' story learning?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I read his graded readers for Spanish.
Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I'm a fan. I think they're pretty good. I Back when I was still studying French, um, I read one of his short stories in French. I think it's like 101 short stories, but they're really short, like a page each.
Right. It's
And
sort of like each one is actually like a dialogue in a
yeah,
greater overarching sort of story.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was like happy to do that, but I didn't think that I was actually going to be learning Spanish. I was just doing this thing for a couple of hours that morning just so I could actually like say that yes, I've used this and I like it, rather than just going, oh, here's this thing that someone paid me to say. And which also I wasn't paid to say. It was like an affiliate thing, so I
Mhm.
wasn't actually paid any money directly for saying anything.
Only
um,
if people liked it and got it from you.
exactly. And then I went to this secondhand book fair where there's always like books in various languages, but there's been a lot of German before. There's actually been one day that there was a lot of Swedish. It seems to depend on which family has donated all their books just before the sale happened, kind of thing. Um, there's often a lot of Croatian and Serbian because there's a lot of like former Yugoslavian people in this city. It's never been Spanish before. And that day it was just awash with Spanish. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird, because there were even some books that I was like, I can now tell the title of that book based on the study I did this morning. Like tiny little things. But and then so I got a couple, and then that afternoon was when we found out that my son was going to Houston. So it was just very strange, and I was just like, I'm taking this as a sign.
I think that's a good sign, and
Mm.
hopefully your experience with story learning and then also your prior study with French aids you quite a bit in acquiring Spanish. As
Yeah,
an
yeah.
American, I have found Spanish to be super duper rewarding. I mean,
Hmm.
you can be in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, go to a bar and find a day laborer. You chat them up.
Okay.
Next thing you know, you're at the back of house of some random Mexican restaurant having a party.
Okay.
Um, and I cannot say that for any of the other languages that I've attempted to learn or am conversational in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and hopefully in Houston, you will also find some good use for it. Um,
Yeah. Hopefully, yeah. Yeah, well, there's actually at the competitions, the first robotics competition, there are some Mexican teams who are going to be there too. So yeah.
yeah, maybe you get some practice at the
Yeah.
robotics competition.
Yeah.
And I know there's a bit of a stigma these days. It's like, don't make people practice your language. It's mean, but I'm gonna I'm gonna get canceled for this. I found that most people, at least in the context of Spanish speakers in the States, where for whatever reason Spanish has a little bit of a lower prestige than English,
Hmm.
have been receptive that an Anglo American or an Anglo Australian is showing interest in the language and the various cultures associated with it. So I'd say give it a shot. Say hi.
Yeah, I've never had anything but positive experiences either, and that's with it's. I have this theory that the more like unex, yeah, the more unexpected it is that you would speak that language, the more uh, positively you'll be received for like even the faintest effort. Um, so yeah, I've been received pretty positively in Swedish at like Swedish gatherings here, even though that's like so unnecessary.
Mhm.
Like there's absolutely no need to learn Swedish just to go to parties full of Swedish people
It
here.
must be fun
Um,
though. I once read an expat thing about how Swedes outside of Sweden are more Swedish than the Swedes inside Sweden.
that's
And it was
probably true. Yeah,
yeah, it was essentially that Swedes of different creeds all bond over things that are quintessentially Swedish. So they try
totally.
really hard to keep the food and the traditions and the gatherings together.
That's absolutely true. And they will also, in my experience, and this is only comparing it to like people who have lived in Sweden and have told me, including Swedes, um, they will also step outside a little bit. They're normally kind of um, distant and like inner selves where they're normally kind of stick to themselves quite a lot. Um, but because they're like, if a Swedish couple comes to like, uh, a Julfest, like Christmas party or something, they will, they've got to, like, they're there to hang out with other Swedes. So, but if they don't know anyone there, they will like walk up to the table and just go like, "Oh, can we sit here?" Which is like, that would be definitely unusual in Sweden, but it's
Mhm.
it's very normal here. And you're totally right. They bond over their Swedishness. Um, they'll play Swedish music at the ones I've been to. They play Swedish music on the over the speakers and stuff, and people all sing along to it, like stuff that they knew as kids, nostalgic stuff. It's actually I would assume, a much warmer environment for learning Swedish than in Sweden, where it's more kind of you're there to live your life and get stuff done. So it's like if you're inconveniencing me by trying to stumble over your Swedish, then I'm going to switch to English because this is boring. But like here, they just like, it would depend on my level. Like it's changed over the years, but initially they were just like, oh, it's so cool that you're learning Swedish. And now they'll talk to me for quite a while, and then they'll be like, wait, where are you from? Yeah.
Yeah, and is it true that you can tell when there's been a party of Swedes based on the General Snus cans, like the little tobacco packs left
Uh,
everywhere?
Probably. I once photographed a what was it? It was a Christmas party with it was the Swedish Australian Chambers of Commerce Business Awards. So they basically like awarding like people who've set up and run various businesses from Sweden, and so stuff like H&M won an award. And the Swedish ambassador was there, so it was like quite a big deal. And this guy comes up to me after one of the photos, like one of the group photos, and says something that I remember as being like, "Oh, can I steal some of your like now I forget what it's called. The actual stuff is like snus."
Snus,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I was like, "Sorry, what?" Like my Swedish wasn't that great at the time, and he was like, don't hold out on me, man. Like I can see it in your pocket." And he thought he could see the shape of it in my pocket, but it was actually my lens cap. So like
Ah,
there is like 80 mils, kind of that.
it's like
He
a
just thought it
circle
was like,
though.
yeah, he thought it was the can. Like they have like a little flat tin of it. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, they probably are into it, but it's also in like highbrow kind of more traditional, well-to-do Swedes. Kind of it's kind of frowned upon.
Frowned upon.
Yeah. So I guess it's somewhat like it's somewhere halfway between tobacco and pot, I guess. In that it's like, as in, it seems a bit more frowned upon than like, well, maybe smoking now, but like smoking in the 90s, it seems a bit more frowned upon than that, but less frowned upon than pot. I don't know.
Gotcha. So it's a weird middle ground.
Yeah.
Speaking speaking of Swedish, there are a fair number of people in the Refold community learning Swedish, and I have a question for people who are not learning Swedish. Are there any Swedish books or series that you would recommend just because they're good, not because they're Swedish, but it's like, oh yeah, this is a great series or it's a great book? One that springs to mind is I know that there's like Bonus Familien, which is like a
Mhm.
really funny sort of sitcom type thing if you want to see a peek into Swedish life. But is there any sort of like modern classics that you would
Yeah,
recommend?
yeah, absolutely. So these are like, yeah, to people in the Swedish learning community, these are going to be old news, but like Caliphate, um, which is on Netflix. Like I think it's even a Netflix original. Um, there's wait, I just had it. Björnstad, Beartown, which is actually an HBO original, so it can be quite hard to find. Um, I mean, you can get it on. Sorry, in the States, you can probably get it on HBO. I'm not sure, but it was one of the debut series of HBO Nordic. So it took me some like weird combination of creating an account in Finland and stuff to get it. But that I personally would not recommend the book. Some people like the book. I think the book is strangely written for the content, but the series is spot on. Like it's really, really good and has some of the best moments in anything that I've seen. Like certain moments that I'm just like that they nailed that. Um, so yeah, those two. There's one called Knutby that I'm not aware of anywhere that you can get with English subtitles, but I'm sure someone out there has made English subtitles out for it. So that is the true story. Well, it's based on a true story. There's a lot of like not true things in it, but it's the based on a true story of a like very cultish kind of church in more like rural Sweden. I'm not I think the
That was
nearest.
not what I was expecting, because when I think of Knut, so I know that B
Mhm.
is like a, I don't know, like a city or
The
something.
village,
It's a
yeah.
pretty, yeah. But when I think of Knut, I think of like the ancient King Knut.
Oh,
Uh,
okay, yeah.
yeah, so I was
um,
expecting some sort of historical drama, but it's about a modern-ish cult. So I
yeah, it
was,
was like in the early 2000s, I think, that it actually happened. This church just got like, I mean, I think they were already weird from the start, but then they got especially weird. And yeah, it resulted in some pretty heavy stuff. Um, but it makes a pretty excellent series. Those who are learning Swedish, who are paying attention, will notice that there's a strong leaning towards Elliot Opheim from my recommendations here, in that she's like a main character in all of them. Um, and it's true. I love Elliot Opheim. I think she's an awesome actress, like probably my favorite actress in any language. Um, but also she just tends to be in really good things. There's actually a couple of hers that I haven't had the time to check out yet, but yeah, those would be my recommend. Actually, there's one more. I'm not aware. Again, I'm not aware of where you can find it these days, but it was on SVT Play for a little while. Just called Drug Dealer, and it's called that in like as in that's its name in Swedish or English. Um, and it's this comedy that's like uh, basically like, yeah, a drug gang, except the head guy of them wants to turn it into like a proper small business. And he wants them to do things that small businesses would do, like, be like really polite to the customers and stuff. um it's just the weirdest comedy, and I don't know if it's funnier to me because of like my level of Swedish is that much less and I need to process things differently or something, but it's resulted in like some proper belly laughs from me. So yeah, I'd recommend that one if people can find it too.
all right. Well, thank you for the introductions. Last Swedish question before we move
Mhm.
on to something else is, have you ever had the surströmming, the
Uh,
sour fermented fish?
no, no. I think the closest I've had was I can never remember the different names, but like just the normal herring, but not fermented herring. Um,
Okay, normal
it's
herring.
still quite strong, and my recollection of that was just that it was really this particular one was doused in so much like kind of savory flavoring to help with the like sour or with the bitterness, I guess, of the fish, that I was like, I just thought it was kind of gross, but not because it was just the texture of it. I was like, bah, it's like eating raw mayonnaise or something. Um,
So it's an incredibly oily fish.
yes, but this had so much other like sauce
Other
stuff
stuff.
on it that, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Um, but no, I haven't
Is
tried
the brown
Surströmming.
cheese, is that also a Swedish thing, or is that more Norway? The
Probably more Norway, since I don't
brun
really know what that is.
brunost.
So
It kind
brunost.
of reminds me of like Vegemite. It's like some sort of byproduct that they
Okay,
ended up eating.
right. Okay, yeah. No,
Okay.
I'm not familiar with that one.
All right.
But
Well,
yeah,
to any of
there's
my Swedish listeners, sorry, I mixed up Sweden and Norway. All right. So, yeah, do you have any future plans with Swedish, or for now, is it mostly going to be stuff like focusing on Spanish?
for now it's mostly focusing on Spanish. But when I say for now, like, we'll see how I feel about it when I get back from the US/Mexico, if I do manage to go. Like, it's at the moment I'm kind of motivated for that, so we'll see how I feel about doing the much more difficult parts. Like, at the moment it's all easy to, like, as it's easy in that it gets, every day I can see my progress. But after that, stage, that'll be around that stage when it's like, oh, getting from B1 to B2 is harder than getting from
Intermediate
A2 to
plateau.
B1 kind of
It's
thing.
dreaded.
Um, but also I am keen. I've got ideas about things I can do to motivate myself to do that. My plans for Swedish are like, so yeah, at the moment, my vague kind of plan is to spend some time on Spanish, take some time off actively learning Swedish. I still listen to Swedish stuff occasionally, just that it like comes up in my life. Um, but take some time off
Are you
actively learning
still like
Swedish.
using your leisure time as Swedish time, like when you would usually be kicking back and doing something to relax? Is it still Swedish?
Um, it can be anything. It,
Okay.
I wouldn't act. No, I wouldn't say I'm like seeking anything out in Swedish. If I watch like a YouTube video or something, it'll often just be in whatever's I've decided I want to watch, which would be in English or sometimes in Swedish.
Like an actual
Like,
Swede.
sorry.
Like an actual Swede, because like actual Swedes don't just seek out Swedish content. They're like, if it's in English, they're gonna watch it in English.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
So,
I guess in that way, it's sorry. You're saying like I'm an actual Swede in that way. Yeah. I guess
exactly.
so. And yeah, it's still very comfortable at the moment. At least I'm not finding Spanish is messing with that. Like I'll at the moment, at least in my comprehension, uh, I will still hear it just as though it's in English, kind of thing.
Now, in the
Um,
past, you've talked
mm,
about dabbling.
yep.
And I don't know if this I don't know if we want to call this Spanish saga a dabble, but you have some thoughts on dabbling and how it can affect your motivation and your relationship with your real language. Do
Yep.
you do you feel like any of that holds true with what's going on with you in Spanish right now and you in Swedish?
Yeah, I would say that I'm not dabbling in Spanish. My intention, at least for now, is to get good at Spanish. Um, because it just like it, it sounds maybe a bit boring and sort of business oriented to do so, but like, when you have a YouTube channel about learning languages, it just makes sense that one of them should be a very popular language. Um, so, but I've never been interested in it before. So I was kind of, okay, let's use this motivation to run up to a stage where I can actually get good at Spanish. Um, and I do have some friends and like former students and things in Mexico and South America. So like I have a kind of ongoing motivation there. Um, so I wouldn't call it dabbling, but at the same time, that is my plan, is to kind of do Spanish for long enough that it starts getting a bit boring, and I just sort of start getting over it, because I'm like, okay, this is mostly kind of revealed its secrets to me. I'm not seeing a lot of things that confuse me anymore. Maybe like words, sure, but not like whole structures where I'm like, wait, what's going on there? And then go back to Swedish, which I'll still be, as long as I don't spend years on Spanish, I'll still be more competent in Swedish, and it'll therefore be fun to have that kind of, like, even now actually when I go back to Swedish, I'll pick up something like a book on my shelf or something, and I'll forget like that it's Swedish, not Spanish, right? So as in I'll have been reading Spanish this morning, say, and I'll pick up a book off my shelf, and I'll forget that it's a Swedish book, not a Spanish book. And so I'll read it and be like, I am understanding this so fluently. Like, man, I've just gotten amazing. And then be like, oh, that's Swedish, not Spanish. That's why I'm understanding it so easily. But that in itself, I don't know if people will get what I mean, but that feels good to have that kind of competence that takes a long time to build up. So my plan is to sort of, okay, when I get a bit bored of Spanish, maybe a month, maybe a week after getting back from the Americas, or no, it's actually North America, um, then maybe go, okay, let's go back to Swedish. Let's see where it is that I'm lacking, because I'll no shame in admitting my Swedish is not that great. It's not like my English. It's good compared to other people who learn Swedish sometimes, depending on how long they've been learning. But it's like, if I had to do something like this, my Swedish sucks. It's
Hmm.
passable, but it's not anything near my English. So I want to go
So
back
you
and
wouldn't say it's
slowly.
near native.
Oh no.
Hmm.
Um, it can full it's strange because I am good at accents. Um, like that's kind of I would kind of call that like my language superpower if I had one, is that I am good at accents, even languages that I don't speak at all. Like someone can say, you say it like this, and I'll say it, and they're like, that was perfect. And it's like, okay, yeah, that one thing was perfect. But now do that for 200,000 phrases and you'll be fluent in the language. So it's a weird thing in Swedish. In a noisy enough, in a noisy or like depending on the ambience, I can speak to Swedes for a while before they'll kind of go, hang on, this is a bit weird. Like you're not. And generally their assumption these days is like, oh, you are
Or
Swedish, but
Finnish.
oh no, they
Oh,
used, yeah, that was initially. Initially, I sounded Finnish because the Finns roll their R's a lot more,
mhm.
and that was my tendency at the beginning. Um, but no, their tendency now, if this, assuming it's in Australia, is to assume that it's like I was maybe 14 and then moved here and have lived here until now. So they're like, oh, you've been here for 20 years, so your Swedish is a bit off, and it occasionally sounds a bit weird. Or often it'll be like a phrasing thing that'll give me away. Like it's like the accent was perfect, but you just said something like, "It is a quite nice day." Like it, not "It is quite a nice day." It is a quite nice day. Something that they're like, "Oh, that doesn't sound quite right." Um, so I'm in no. To answer your question, I'm not near native. Certainly not in how I feel speaking it, but I'm competent in that I don't have any trouble reading a book or something like that. But no, no, definitely not near native. There are people on the Refold in the Refold community who are definitely more near native in whatever language they're studying than I am.
for sure. I've noticed a lot of people who are studying Swedish in the Refold community tend to have more robust ties to Sweden than you do. And I mean
Mhm.
that in either they're Swedish born abroad, or their boyfriend is Swedish, or they have moved to Sweden from a different country. Um, so I can imagine that some of them who, I mean, if you're living there for 10 years and you go really hard, you're probably going to make some really solid progress towards being native. And being native is sometimes more than just sounding native, it's the literal cultural tidbits that you may not pick up from immersion and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, Even I've found one of the one of the most obvious things to me is like my behavior, in that I'll now that I'm basing most of this on the last time I was at a Swedish gathering, which was midsummer, so that was 6 months ago. But um, I found my language was coming out very fluently, but I'll often tend to joke like an Australian will joke. Um, and Swedes here will often be used to that, but it's like when I kind of observe them and how they behave around each other, it's not the same as how Australians will joke a bit more freely. I think we'll often our joke is to like have a go at each other, to say
Banter.
like, yeah.
That's
And I
something
think
we
that
Americans
Swedes
do
are
not do.
okay.
Americans and Canadians, I feel closer with Canadians because the rest of the Commonwealth, so New Zealand,
Mm,
Australia, the UK, you guys all have that banter culture where you guys sort of take pot shots at each other.
yeah,
Um, and I've got a friend from England. He used to be my neighbor, and I'm a bigger guy, and he would just very freely make jokes about my size, like, "Ah, don't fall through," if I'm sitting on, like, a rickety sort of Filipino chair or something, and, like,
yeah,
I'm used to it because I've been abroad, but definitely, like, at least in Kentucky in the South, that would get you popped.
yeah. Okay, yeah,
And that sort of behavior can be very jarring to people who are not from, say, another Commonwealth country.
yeah. Exactly. So I was like, okay, that's probably a bit more extreme than I would be willing to go, especially at like a gathering of people I don't know.
Of
Um,
Swedes.
yeah, like, but even just like people I don't know, I'm not gonna say anything about someone's weight. But um, like I would, it's more like I would often sarcastically like like there were these competitions of like, but like silly things like I don't know if you guys know, like an egg on spoon race, egg and spoon race. So like holding an egg
You hold it
on a
in your
spoon.
mouth.
I think this one was just with your hand, but
Okay.
like an egg on a teaspoon, and you have to hold it level. And like when the egg inevitably falls, my reaction is just to be like, "Oh, what are you doing? You've lost the whole game for us," kind of thing. But of course, I'm not being serious. But like I think in Swedish culture, it's more expected that you would all just laugh and be like, "Oh well, we lost," kind of thing. And I didn't necessarily come across that straight away. That's like, I'm actually joking. I'm not concerned about losing the egg and spoon race. Um, but I'm just translating what I would say in English into Swedish. I'm not actually translating, of course, but I'm just taking how I would behave in Australian over to Swedish, and that's a cultural thing that I'm definitely not picked up.
So I have heard that every healthy human, someone who's not been abused and locked in a shed, has two
Mhm.
things. They have a language and a culture. And I see
Mhm.
this conflated a whole bunch on Refold, actually. People talk about an English speaking culture, but I've already given you an example where
Yeah.
North American Anglophones, like Americans and Canadians, we differ in that we're not as sarcastic, we're not as into bantering and light jabs.
Yep.
And essentially, I think you've touched on a point that you can be relatively competent in the language, but not be totally fluent and competent in the cultural aspects.
Absolutely.
And believe it or not, as you know, Swedish is spoken in quite a few different places. Åland,
Mhm.
it's spoken in Sweden, and then it's spoken in parts of Finland that are not Åland, which has a slightly different relationship with
Mhm.
the rest of Finland. And I'm sure that that Swedes in those different regions, even in Sweden, act differently,
Yep.
you know. But it's possible to be, and I think you see this a lot with English speakers who are not non-native English speakers, because how
Yep.
big English is, such a
Yep.
global language, is that you can meet someone from a small village in China that has very, very good English and knows nothing about the culture, right? They're still
Yep.
going to be incredibly Chinese when they interact with you.
Yep. Yep.
Now,
And sometimes it can be a positive thing, like uh, depending on the situation and which culture they are from. Like I used to work with a Venezuelan girl who would just like, she had so much energy. She was just so vibrant. Her English was actually quite bad. um, given the job we had to do, like which involved a lot of talking, but she was everyone's favorite colleague and uh, like client. As yeah, as a company, they would often ask for her next year. Like they'd say, "Can we get that same girl next year?" Because she had this amazing energy that made everything feel so fun. So it can be a good thing.
right. Yeah, I
Sorry,
think
I
there's
interrupted.
definitely. Oh, no, 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 no. I think there's definitely room for uh, differences in culture, and even at Refold, we've got our graphic designers from Ethiopia.
Hmm.
Um, some of our people are from Canada. Um, we used to have a team from the Philippines, so sometimes it just adds flavor.
Yeah,
You don't want all the same flavor. Sometimes a little bit of variety can be nice, and uh, yeah, I think that's great. Now,
yeah,
moving back to language stuff, I have a question for you. And this is a me question.
yeah.
Have you noticed any difference in content? Now, maybe you've not been at Spanish long enough to notice, but like
Hmm.
you mentioned
Yeah.
that actually, surprisingly, Swedish does have a whole bunch of content. So many books are
Hmm.
translated.
Yes.
They have a big
Yes.
audiobook culture. You talk about this a bunch for a
Yep.
small language of like 10 million people.
Yep.
Um, they have a lot of content, but
A lot. Yep.
Spanish must be on a different level. At least that would be my assumption. Full coding courses in Spanish. When I go to YouTube,
Yeah.
I can learn everything I need in Spanish. And I would imagine Swedish might be a little bit more limited, but I'm not really
Oh, yeah.
sure. I could be
Yeah.
wrong.
In that regard, Swedish is so much more limited in because and I've mentioned this in a video. If you want to say learn to play the piano, which is something like I have a music degree, so I'm not like a complete novice in the piano, but I'm not a trained pianist in any sense. Um, if you want to do that and you look it up in Swedish, you'll be lucky to find like a series of videos, not even a channel. It'll be like maybe I'm naming specific examples a lot today, but like yeah, I remember trying to do that in Swedish, being like, now that I know music and I know Swedish, so I should be able to like learn something about music through Swedish. And I found like two videos that were for like school age kids, as in for Swedish kids, and like two videos, and that was it. And they weren't very comprehensive kind of thing. Whereas I know, like I haven't actually checked this yet, but I know that if I wanted to learn to play the piano in Spanish, I'm sure I could find a channel, maybe a couple of channels dedicated to that. But no, I haven't really looked into it yet, because I'm still sort of on the semi like what do you like guided content kind of thing, like so I'm just enjoying like being on dreaming Spanish, just watching all their videos, like because like they, even if you just take intermediate level and just Mexican Spanish, there's still like a lot of videos for me to watch, and that I'm more about picking up like little what are like filler words.
Mhm.
I'm trying to pick up that sort of stuff, because otherwise, if I go straight to something like Mr. Salas and he's just talking like fluently the whole time, I'll miss that. Like he might say like pues or así que, and I'm like, I didn't actually get that. That wasn't part of what he was saying. That was just like a thing in between.
It's just like, well,
The,
believe it or not, they
yeah.
actually do that in the Philippines as well. They spell it
Okay.
differently. They spell it with
Yeah.
Philippine rules, PWES, but it's been borrowed as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
So it's just stuff
the
like
cool thing
yeah.
the cool thing about Spanish is that like you can turn Duolingo into an immersion experience because there are languages in Spanish for
Yes.
Spanish
Okay.
speakers
Yes.
on Duolingo that are not
Yeah.
available. So there's Catalan and there's
Hmm.
Guarani, which is spoken in like
Paraguay.
Paraguay.
So
So
my some of my best friends actually live in Paraguay. Like
yeah,
I went, my wife and I both went to school with them, and they've moved there. So they are like they're pretty fluent in Spanish now, I think, but they're also learning Guarani.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've always maintained that once your Spanish is good enough, you can break
Mm.
Duolingo and make it immersive because you're learning what I need from Spanish
Yep.
through Duolingo.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, there's university courses on it all on YouTube in Spanish.
Yep.
Um, so it's very salient to me because even with Filipino, you suffer from the same like high level stuff tends to be in English, or it tends to be
Yep.
in Taglish that's really at that point mostly English with a
Yep.
few words like pues or lang
Yep.
or any of the discourse particles borrowed in. Um,
Yep.
so interesting. Yeah,
Yep.
big divide. Well, I really support this. Not that I have anything against Swedish, but I think that speaking a global macro language like English with just it's a whole other thing. Then you've got your sort of niche language, and then you've got another sort of large regional lingua franca. I think it will
Yep.
make you a very well-rounded language influencer because you'll have the perspective of somebody who's learning a small language. Not that 10 million speakers is that small, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Um,
It's not. It is when you combine that with the fact that they mostly speak very fluent English,
mhm,
and a lot of their content. Yeah, so that's what I didn't finish saying before, is that like you might find a Swede running a piano learning channel, but they'll just be doing it in English. Like,
mhm.
you can
One of the
find a
biggest
Swedish
YouTubers in
gaming
the
channel.
world, PewDiePie,
Yeah, yeah.
does his stuff in English.
A couple of them actually. Like, so I don't Rumi is a music channel. It's like less, it's not tutorials, but it's like music. He worked with PewDiePie on like one of his songs. Um, Also, his English is actually much better than PewDiePie's. But yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. I hope that that is the case.
Yeah. So looking here, before we go,
Mm,
we're getting close to time, and I think this has
mhm.
been a great podcast. Before we go, I have a question for you. If you had any advice you could give to past Lamont, what would it be?
Language related or
I'm
just anything?
assuming language related.
Okay,
I,
yeah.
I I submitted a list to the other Refold employees. I'm like, hey,
Yeah.
got a great opportunity with Lamont here. So I'm assuming it's going to be language related.
Um, it would mainly be to not try to be better than you are, because I think that actually holds you back. So to admit that, like, it might take me, if I decide I'm going to read a page of this novel, because I want to pick up the vocab from it, that it might take me 8 minutes or 12 minutes or something to read one page, and not try and be like, suddenly go like, oh no, but if I'm going to be like a proper Spanish speaker, I need to read a novel like I would an English novel. And I tried to do that a lot in Swedish. I tried to be like more hardcore and like, oh, I'm not a proper Swedish speaker unless I read this whole like kids novel in the next 3 hours, because that's how long the audiobook is. And I was doing this after like 8 months, and like, I would fail at, and it just holds you up. Like it's so much quicker to just say what is at my level now, what is slightly above that, and do that. So that would be my main advice, and that would lead into everything else that,
So
yeah,
sort of like saying ultimately the I+1, the level and slightly above your level, ends up being better than trying to be super hardcore and jump into things that are way above your level.
exactly, yeah. um
I,
yeah,
yeah, I think that's a good moral. I think that's a good moral, a good ending to the episode. So, guys, thank you so much for coming to this podcast, and I'll see you guys around. Bye.
thanks guys, bye.
Thanks for coming and listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck because we have an after party over in the Refold Central Discord server right after. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought by liking the video and leaving a comment below. If you have suggestions for upcoming visitors, guests, or even requests for particular topics, please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching or listening, and I'll see you next week.